Everyone to this discussion on examining the role of arms transfers and militarism in the Israel-Palestine conflict. My name is Hine-Wai and I'm the Control Arms representative based in Geneva. Control Arms is a global coalition that works to prevent the human suffering caused by irresponsible arms transfers. Previously, Control Arms advocated against the transfer of weapons to the warring parties engaged in the Yemen conflict. Earlier this year, we condemned the supply of weapons to Myanmar's military, and now we are speaking out on transfers of weapons to be used in the Israel-Palestine conflict. Today, we are fortunate to bring together a distinguished lineup of experts who are going to set out their views on arms transfers and militarism in the Israel-Palestine conflict. To get our discussions underway, I have the pleasure of inviting Martin Butcher, a Control Arms board member, to make opening remarks. Over to you, Martin.
Thank you, Hine-Wai. I'm very pleased to be here today. I think it's a very important discussion at the moment, especially in the context of the Arms Trade Treaty. For Control Arms, over the past 10 years of the Arms Trade Treaty, the most important thing has been the integrity of the treaty regime and our efforts to use the mechanisms of the treaty to preserve its role as a tool for global security building, and most importantly, given the aims and objectives of the treaty, as a human security building tool. That's absolutely vital. I have sadly to say that we have been disappointed over the years at the lack of debate and of action within treaty processes to rein in arms transfers, or even to call out arms transfers, which seem to us obviously in contravention of the treaty, where these have occurred in different contexts. In the current context of the latest escalation of violence between Palestinian armed groups and Israel, and in particular in the extreme reaction that Israel has unleashed on Gaza in the past couple of months, we have a context where both Palestinian armed groups and the IDF have been seen to commit war crimes so widespread as to amount to crimes against humanity. And in that context, there are mechanisms in the Arms Trade Treaty, firstly Article 6, that states parties should be applying. Given the statements of the Israeli government and the actions of Israel on the ground in Gaza, states can be said to have knowledge that arms they supply will be used in the commission of serious violations of international law, and therefore should not be supplying any arms. And even if this were not the case, it's obvious that there is a clear risk that violations will occur. So Article 7 should kick in. States also have an obligation under Common Article 1 of the 4 Geneva Conventions to uphold international humanitarian law. So it's clear to us that the states parties of the ATT are failing in their duty under that treaty and under the Geneva Conventions when they transfer arms into the conflict at the moment. That last obligation also applies to the United States, which, while not a state party to the ATT, is a signatory and has a Vienna Convention duty not to undermine the object and purposes of the ATT. And the US is, of course, by far the largest arms supplier to Israel, and we'll hear from Josh Paul later about that. So, and it's simply to conclude my introduction, for control arms, it's vital that the arms trade is not an instrument of the commission of war crimes and crimes against humanity, that people are put before profit of the arms industry, and that sales into this conflict as it's happening at the moment just stop. Thank you.
Thanks very much, Martin. And I just want to talk about very briefly on organisational matters. While the posting of questions and the Q&A function is most welcome, I do wish to make a disclaimer, and that is in order to take full advantage of the panelists' expertise and experience. We already have a number of questions lined up. As a result, we might not be able to address all questions that are submitted, but we will endeavour to do so. So let's get underway, and the first round of questions is really to set the scene. And these are aimed at providing the overall picture as to the origins and capacities of the weapons fueling and being used in this conflict. Our first speaker is Doaa Elnakhala, who is Senior Researcher at the Small Arms Survey. Doaa, what types of weapons are being transferred to Israel and Palestinian armed groups, and where are those weapons coming from? Over to you.
Thanks a lot. Thanks for organizing this. Just one little note before I start answering this question. What I'm going to say here is based on my personal effort, and I don't consider myself an expert of arms transfers anywhere, including Israel. But I am specialized in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict. I have more than 20 years of experience working on that conflict. I'll try to be quick, as I know deadlines are serious. Let me share my screen, because there are some numbers and figures that I'd like to share with everybody. So just to answer that question, can you see the screen?
Yep, perfectly.
So I did some research for the purpose of this discussion, just to have an idea what sorts of weapons are being transferred to Israel by different parties. And this is a list in front of you of all sorts of conventional combat. So in fact, I did in the beginning of the research, I didn't realize this is only one category of arms being transferred into Israel. Those are big machines being used in combat. So you got aircraft, air defense systems, etc. Just the same data and presented in different format. I took this information and plugged it into an Excel sheet and tried to make some sort of presentation of the same arms transfers over a 10-year period. Unfortunately, we do not have any data after 2022 from CIPRI, which is normal. So 10 years, what was the item that was transferred most to Israel under this category? So it looks like aircrafts, followed by ships, which I would say war ships, and that is followed by missiles, armored vehicles, in addition to other conventional combat weapons. Now, is this everything? Of course not. So I tried to look at other sources. One of the normally trusted sources is the UN ROCA. The UN ROCA is basically relies on reports, official reports by importers and exporters of transferred arms. Of course, not fully exhaustive of all transactions, but at least it gives us an idea of what's out there. It turns out that what CIPRI has is only falls under the third column in this table, which is major conventional weapons. However, there are more categories, including small arms and light weapons. And as you can see in front of you, there are many other categories that are being imported into Israel from different sources. So we have, for instance, revolvers, self-loaded pistols. I would say that the arms that we have on the left-hand side, those are arms used also for civilian and personal uses, but can be also used by the military. So where do these arms come from? The top three sources are the US, and I'm not talking about the difference of 1% or 2%. We're talking about a huge difference between the amounts being transferred from the top one and the top two. So the US it comes on the top of the list, followed by Germany and Italy. Just to double check from other sources, that was the outcome from my research on CIPRI. The other source that I checked with is the UN ROCA. It confirms the information provided by CIPRI, but also I found other smaller states providing arms under different categories, such as Slovakia, Czech Republic, and of course, France is interesting. And I try to only look at the past few years and not go long in time. And also try to identify countries that repeatedly had exported arms to Israel. So under the category small arms and light weapons, we have USA again, Slovakia, Czech Republic, and France. And for the major conventional weapons, we have USA again, Slovakia, Czech Republic, Germany, Italy, Serbia, and the UK. And of course, as we know, as of 7th of October, there is more and more bigger amounts of weapons were flown into Israel, particularly from the US. These numbers are from media reports, of course, not verified. I could not verify them yet, but there are several resources talking about more weapons being shipped to Israel. So, yeah. So as for the Palestinian factions, that's a more difficult category to capture. Of course, the Palestinian factions, not only Hamas, receive supplies of weapons from abroad, but they also develop their own homemade weapons. But all of them do not compare to the amounts and capabilities provided of weapons provided to Israel. Palestinian factions have small arms, light weapons, IEDs, of course, in addition to ammunitions, which also applies to Israel, by the way. Though most of those weapons come via or from Iran into the Gaza Strip. Now, how do they come? That's another vague question. I mean, the answer to that question is vague. I mean, but mostly I would assume from tunnels or by sea. Again, unconfirmed information. There are claims about having Chinese and Russian-made weapons being between the hands of different Palestinian factions, but that does not mean that those countries were directly involved in transfers. This is an area that needs some research. I think I will stop here.
Thanks very much, Doaa. Thanks for providing this very helpful overview. I'll now bring in Eitay Mack, who is a Israeli human rights lawyer and advocate, to provide his insights into Israel's weapons manufacturing capabilities and the quantity of weapons in its possession. Eitay, over to you.
Thank you. So Israel arm industry was developed the 70s, actually from the 50s, but in the 70s was the big jump. And the reason for that was as a part of the trauma of the Israeli government because of the slowness and delay of arms shipment from the Nixon government during the 73 war, when Israel felt that it's going to lose the war. And then what happened, Israel decided to produce everything on its own, and the things that Israel don't produce are things that are too expensive to produce for a small country. And also because the Israeli military cannot support on its own all the military industries, almost 60% of the Israeli company production is going to export. Through the years, the US transferred the military aid worth $3 billion each year. In the 80s, it was really important because Israel was lacking foreign money. But in the last 20 decades, 30 decades almost, this aid become more political than military of concerning its importance, because Israel current GDP is 522 billion and the aid is 3 billion. The question is what the US is ready to sell Israel outside of the aid. And then we come to the F-35s and other equipment that for Israel to produce on its own, it's more expensive. So there's separate question about the aid, and also there's a question what the US is ready to sell Israel, if Israel is ready to buy. Since the war started, there are almost daily shipments of ammunition to Israel that are being used in Gaza. I think there's no question about it. There's no way that Israel could have continued all its bombing in Gaza without the shipment from the US, because then the meaning is that Israel will need to open its emergency stocks. What's the meaning of it is that this could give light to Hezbollah and other enemies of Israel in the area, Iran, the Iranian militias in Syria and other places, that this is their chance to join the war. So even the arms supplies now has a political and geopolitical meaning. And of course, the people that paying the price of the civilians in Gaza, because there's no question, I think, that the arms supply from the US on a daily basis are lingering the war. But then there's, as I said, the question, what would happen if the US stopped doing it? I think Israel will continue the war, just with different type of weapons, less precise, that will cause more damage. We saw that between the war of 28 to 2014, in 2014, Israel used 8 times more mortar shells, which is a statistic weapon, not precise. And I think with the government in Israel that include ministers that support genocide, terror, and full apartheid, probably they will just continue. So I think we have a very difficult question what the US should do, but we have to understand that we have a mix. We have to discuss everything, like what will be the practical consequences, what the political meaning, what the political for the area, and also, of course, what the price that the civilians are paying, and they will probably keep paying, because I think there's no pressure on Israel from its allies, but also not on Hamas from its allies to stop the war.
Okay, thank you very much, Eitay. Thank you for what you've set out. And to continue on this discussion, I now turn to Josh Paul, and who was the former director in the US State Department's Bureau of Political Military Affairs and resigned over US arms transfers to Israel. Josh, following up on what Eitay's outlined, this seems to be a crazy situation where Israel, in fact, is producing so many weapons that it actually has scope to then export those weapons, and that there's already such a strong supply of weapons from the US. Does Israel at this moment really need the supply of more weapons?
Yeah, no, thank you very much for that question, and also let me just say thank you very much for having me. I'm honoured to be joining you all, having just stepped out of government. To be welcomed into the control arms community is really means a lot. So thank you for having me. I think, does Israel need arms transfers? I think Eitay was just touching on this. In some ways, it does, right? It cannot produce F-35 fighter jets, tanker aircraft, ships, and munitions at sort of the quantity that it is consuming. And for other purposes by itself. So it is reliant, and particularly as has been identified by Doaa, on America for that supply of arms. I think we need to break the question down a bit. And the first question is, does it need those weapons now? And here I would say no. I think there is a very good reason for the US in particular to pause and to use the leverage, which we'll talk about later, to sort of influence the situation, to push for a ceasefire, and to see what other influence can be brought to bear. I think it's hard to quantify what Israel's exact stockpiles are at this point. It's always hard actually, for the US to quantify even what our closest allies and partners have at any one point in their stockpiles. But it's clear that the burn rate for items like 155mm artillery ammunition, for items like air-to-ground munitions, including both dumb bombs and the precision kits that you strap to them, are extremely high right now, if you look at what is happening in Gaza. And what that means is that right now, Israel is not having to make any trade-offs in its defense planning as it stands. And the consequences of that, there was an article yesterday in 972 magazine, which described how Israel's strategy is to purposefully use larger munitions to create punitive effects on the population. I think there would be a stronger consideration of what we call weapons mensuration, which is essentially weapon selection based on the target for Gaza, if there was a horizon to Israel's stockpile, if it could see that horizon and knew that there was a limit to its supply of arms, which right now I don't know that it does. And I think as well, we can draw a sort of a Venn diagram around weapon sets involved in Israel's need to defend itself legitimately against external threats, including Iran, versus those that it is using in Gaza. And there is going to be some overlap. Joint Directors hack munitions, for example, but there is also some significant areas that don't overlap. And so, for example, we saw recently the US notified, the US Biden administration notified Congress of the potential sale of something called SPICE bomb kits. These are a much shorter range precision-guided kit than the JDAM enables, and would not, for example, be of much use in an Iran contingency. So I think a deeper level of analysis is needed. What types of weapons are we talking about? For instance, I don't think anyone is talking about holding back systems such as Iron Dome, which is a defensive capability. So there are different types of weapon sets. I think the weapons we should be talking about that are of greatest concern are, first of all, propelled explosives. And what I mean by that are things like 155mm artillery shells, air-to-ground munitions, and associated precision kits. And there's a discussion to be had there, and we had it within the US government in the context of Saudi-led coalition operations in Yemen, as to whether holding back precision guidance kits actually leads to the use of dumb bombs. I think, given the reporting about how Israel is selecting targets, I don't find that, frankly, a very convincing discussion in the current context, because I think the problem here is one of intent, not capability. We can also, I think we need to talk about firearms, and Doaa touched on this. Firearms, as you all know, are the world's leading contributor to deaths in conflict, much more so than bombs around the world. And of course, there is a significant risk of the use, and we are seeing this too, in the West Bank now, of firearms being misused, resulting in civilian casualties there. Either way, I think the important thing, and we'll talk about this more, is it is vital to maintain an oversight of what is going into Israel and to apply the law, both international law and domestic law as it stands.
Josh, thanks very much for breaking down my question into something much more comprehensible and for outlining quite clearly what is going into Israel. Now we've reached round 2 of our questions. And in this round, we're going to really pick up on some of the issues that Martin Butcher outlined in his opening remarks. And that is about the obligations of international law. And so we're going to delve into those obligations that states must comply with when deciding to transfer conventional weapons. I'm delighted to invite Sam Perlo-Freeman, who's a researcher at the Campaign Against the Arms Trade, otherwise known as CAT, to explain what are the key considerations that a state must take into account when deciding whether to transfer weapons. Over to you, Sam.
Thank you, Hine-Wai. So there are a number of international treaties that regulate arms exports of various types. Of course, there are UN Security Council arms embargo on all UN member states. There are only a handful of those, of course, and Israel is not covered by any of those. There is the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, for which signatories are bound not to help any of the countries that are not nuclear powers under the NPT from developing nuclear weapons. Arguably, the US and other countries already broke that in helping Israel develop their nuclear weapons that the US and UK still won't say if they have or not. But obviously this doesn't apply in the current conflict. There are the conventions on landmines and cluster munitions for those that are signatories to them. Again, that's not something that's being, as far as I know, used in the current war. Cluster munitions, I haven't seen reports of it at any rate, and I expect there would be reports if they were being used. Then, as Martin talked about, there's the Arms Trade Treaty, to which the US has signed and unsigned, which exactly what that means as a state that hasn't ratified. I think if you ask 2 international lawyers, you'll get 3 answers. But at any rate, arguably, it still does have obligations under that. And certainly all the European suppliers of Israel and others have those obligations. And these apply to certain categories of major conventional weapons, to small arms and light weapons. They apply to munitions for such weapons, and they apply to components if those components are capable of being assembled into the weapons that are covered by the main categories. So that's potentially quite wide-ranging. Article 6 says that absolute prohibition if they have knowledge that the arms would be, or items would be used in the commission of genocide, crimes against humanity, grave breaches of the Geneva Convention of 1995, 49, attacks directed against civilian objects or civilians protected as such, or other war crimes. Knowledge, that's a high bar. It's not to do with a risk. It's, we're pretty sure about this. But given what Israel is doing, that there are attacks on civilian objects on a daily basis, hospitals, schools, churches, mosques, it's really hard to argue that that is not happening. Moreover, the almost complete blockade, not allowing most food, water supplies, no clean water going in, electricity, fuel going into Gaza, which of course punishes the entire civilian population. I think it's really, and which that blockade relies on the weapons that Israel has and that are being supplied. It's really hard to argue that that's not a war crime or worse being committed. So arguably Article 6 should stop all states parties and arguably the US as a signatory and unsignatory from supplying arms. And as Martin said, even if Article 6 doesn't apply, the risk of serious violations of IHL or IHRL seem to be, again, pretty clear. It's not clear what could be taken to mitigate that risk to prevent there being an overriding risk. So to me and to a lot of observers, the case under the ATT seems pretty clear. The problem with the ATT is that there is no enforcement mechanism. There is no way that one state can take another state to some sort of body under the ATT or the UN and say, you are breaking the ATT, we want action taken to stop this. It all depends on its interpretation by member states. They have completely free hand, essentially, to interpret them as they see fit. And in particular on the treaty being written into national laws, which it is in some cases and not in others, obviously not in the case of the United States. There have been cases, as our friends at Safer World with their Arms Trade Litigation Monitor have been collecting, of groups that have been trying to use the ATT as written international law to stop certain arms sales, mostly to Saudi Arabia for use in Yemen. These have not got very far. There can be problems of standing. Does the organization have legal standing to bring the case? Of justiciability. In France, for example, arms export decisions are considered an acte de gouvernement, an act of government which cannot be questioned by the courts at all. There can be problems of transparency, getting enough information about what licenses are being approved to be able to meaningfully bring a case at all. We brought a case against UK arms sales to Saudi Arabia, 30 seconds, yeah. Not based on ATT, but on UK national law. That just failed this year, though it did, a previous case succeeded. The only other thing I'd say quickly is that export control treaties are not the only aspect of international law that applies. The Genocide Convention, international criminal law, there is a strong case that the US and other arms suppliers to Israel are engaged in aiding and abetting war crimes. And there are efforts to try to get the ICC to take that up. The war crimes in question are being committed in the state of Palestine, which is a signatory to the ICC, and so is under ICC jurisdiction. So even if the treaties that govern arms exports as such are not able to be enforced, then international criminal law, the ICC, or perhaps the International Court of Justice do offer alternative avenues.
Thanks very much, Sam. That's a good point that you finish on, that, there's no one treaty exists in a vacuum, and we do have to use all of the tools at our disposal. And on this matter, I want to ask you a follow-up question, and I know on this question you're going to respect the time, and that is,
yes.
In CAT's litigation, what information do you draw on to substantiate your arguments?
In our case, the details of the main exports by the UK to Saudi Arabia were fairly open. We knew that they'd sold Eurofighters, that was very public. We knew they'd sold the munitions for them. It was very much in the public domain, Brimstone and Storm Shadow missiles and Paveway 4 guided bombs. The government confirmed in Parliament in response to parliamentary questions that these planes and previously supplied Tornadoes were being used by Saudi Arabia in Yemen and the munitions with them. We had confirmation from various sources that the UK, including official governmental ones, that the UK was continuing to supply components and spare parts. That's an important aspect. Any major combat aircraft, especially when in active operations like in Gaza at the moment, high intensity operations, need a mammoth quantity of spare parts constantly. So in our case, the problem of transparency, which often applies, didn't apply. We had plenty of information to know that what arms were being transferred and that they were being used. At the other end, what were they being used for? groups like Moatana, as well as others like Amnesty and Oxfam, had collected lots and lots of information on individual cases of attacks on civilian targets by the Saudi-led coalition. The problem, though, was one, hiding behind the coalition, we could never be sure if an individual attack was carried out by Saudi Arabia or the UAE or possibly someone else, and two, exactly which weapons were used. For our case, the second one, was it a US plane and munition or a UK one, if it was a Saudi one? And about half and half the attack fleet was from each. But that didn't really matter for our case because the threshold was clear risk. And so if the violations of IHL were being committed, even if it turned out that all of them were committed by with US planes instead of UK ones, that wouldn't remove the clear risk that the UK planes and munitions could be used for the same sort of thing as they were flying the same sorts of missions. But nonetheless, although this was a much better information situation than a lot of NGOs have when they're trying to bring these cases. But even so, that there were problems, especially at the what exactly is being used and who's doing the attacks.
Yeah, thanks very much, Sam. That's very interesting. What you outline as the challenges, and making the necessary connections and bringing a case forward to a court case. The Arms Trade Treaty is the key mechanism, the key instrument of international law that Control Arms focuses on. Control Arms was actually established to bring about the negotiation of the ATT, and now we work on that instrument's universalization, increasing its membership, and on its implementation. And as both Martin and Sam have, emphasized, Article 6 prohibits arms transfers by states parties if they know that the arms could be used in war crimes, grave breaches of the Geneva Conventions, or attacks directed against civilians or other international crimes. Now, the next, and this really comes to the crux of the ATT, is Article 7, which mandates a risk assessment before arms are transferred. Specifically, the Article 7 assessment requires weapons not to be transferred as if there is an overriding risk that the weapons would contribute to undermining peace and security, and or could be used to facilitate violations of international humanitarian law and international human rights law. Clearly, in this situation, there is not only an overriding risk of such violations, but in the fighting we have witnessed since this conflict started, the violations of international law have occurred in real time and in plain sight by both sides. In Gaza, and over a short period of time, more than 14,000 civilians have been killed and every second home has been destroyed. What is important in making this assessment by the exporting states is the past behaviour of a state. In other words, a state's track record on compliance with international humanitarian law and human rights. And this is really a key component of the risk assessment. Now, I'm going to go back to our panelists and to ask them what they would want states transferring weapons that are considering transferring weapons into this context to take into account. So, Doaa, I now return to you. Doaa, are you?
Was I muted?
Yeah, you're right now.
Okay, so I would like to to answer that question, I would like everybody to have a look at this graph. This is a graph I created when I first heard about this discussion. I mean, when we're talking about transfer and transfer of weapons and how would that impact any conflict anywhere, the first thing that comes to mind is either the damage that has been, the material damage that has been going on in that conflict for over a certain period of time, and the casualties, which includes both injuries and deaths. So this is what I have collected from, again, the arms transfers presented here by the black line. This is data from CIPRI, which focuses on basically the arms transfers to any country, and here it's Israel, to Israel, based on the known cost of a certain transfer. So we know the commodity, we know what is the cost of that commodity that is being transferred. And these numbers for the arms transfers on the left-hand side of the graph, they are in millions. So if we compare 2012 to 2022, we can see that the line generally is on the rise. In fact, it went up from 5,000 to 30,000. That's a big increase in arms transfers. Again, this is only about conventional weapons. So we're not talking about light weapon, small arms or light weapons or even ammunitions. So it's only one category of weapons being transferred into Israel over 10 years. And I wanted to compare those to the number of casualties. And I went to the OCHA, which is a UN organization that keeps track of casualties that happened over time in the Palestinian territories by Israeli forces, of course. And the red bars, the stripped red bars, those are the number of casualties from 2012 until 2022, same period of time. And the axis on the right hand side, this is the number. This stands for the number of casualties. So it's interesting to have a look at this graph, just to see if there's any correlation. Let's not say claim it's a causal relationship. Every time there was an increase in the number in the numbers of arms transfers to Israel, there was an increase. It was followed by an increase in the number of casualties. Of course, there are outliers such as 2018. So I went online and searched what was going on in 2018. It was the time when the Great March of Return was launched in Gaza. Non-armed protests trying to cross the borders to return to their homes, which they believe to be in the 1948 area, were taken all over by Israel in the 1948 war. Demanding to lift the siege on Gaza. Again, another explanation for that outlier case is that possibly if we can plug into that more data from covering light weapons, small arms, and ammunitions, there might be more, I would expect more correlation between the two variables. Another thing to keep in mind is that we know in 2023, more weapons got transferred into Israel and more people were killed in Palestine. So just to have a look on this graph, this is a graph produced by the CNN and published on the 7th of November, which includes 2023, which is not over, by the way. So there might be more people dying and injured before the end of the year. We still have 1 month and there is an escalation going on. But if you compare 2023 to 2014, for instance, which is the second spike on the graph, the difference is massive. This is more like multiplied by 7, if I remember correctly, more or less. Of course, there is a rise in the number of Israeli casualties as well. We know why. But the increase in the number of the Palestinian casualties is way above the expected level. If you look at the period of time from 2008 until 2023, definitely there is a big spike that we could see at the bottom of the chart. And I'm going to stop here.
Thanks very much, Doaa. That's some, that's some interesting information that you've presented there. Now, I'll go to Eitay. Eitay, from your perspective as a human rights lawyer, what is it that you would want states to take into account when deciding on whether to transfer weapons to Israel?
So, as it was said, Israel is not part of the ATT, and the tools that I'm using, Israel is a member of almost all the human rights and convention. One of the basic principles is that a country is not allowed to aid in war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is the argument I'm using in dozens of legal procedures concerning Israel defense export to genocide and war crimes and crimes against humanity in dozens of countries around the world. And this should also apply to Israel, that when a country or an arm dealer or a arm company is considering exporting to Israel, it has to verify that it's not contributing to war crimes or crimes against humanity. And I think before we get to the question if that is actually what is happening, we have to make it to be clear that there's no process. You mentioned before Article 6 in the ITT. I think most of the Western countries don't see Israel as committing war crimes and crimes against humanity. And this is why they don't see any problem in the export. But there's no process. I read the article in the New Yorker with the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee in the American Senate. He only said that the US is exporting Iron Dome. And you know, everything is open in the Israeli media. Both the journalists and he could read in the Israeli media and start discussing the bombs that the US is sending. But I think I and an Israeli human rights organization like Committed for Peace, Mothers Against Violence, and others of Israelis through the years wrote many letters to the US, to the EU, to put conditions on its arm transfer, on its aid on Israel concerning human rights. And also we asked for sanctions and embargo of specific security units that are known to commit extrajudicial killing and other incidents. We are still waiting for a reply. So I think none of these processes are happening nowhere, not in the US, not in the UK, not in the EU, not in Germany. And I think the process itself is an important leverage on Israel to behave better. Another thing that I want to say is that, in my opinion, and it's based on reading hundreds of files, Israel don't care about the what it's called the collateral damage to civilians in Gaza. They don't count the bodies. They don't care about it. In the West Bank, they do it because they're afraid that if in one incident, for example, there will be a huge massacre, then there will be a third intifada that will explode. But in Gaza, they don't care. And I think, sadly, most of the Western countries also don't count the bodies of civilians in Gaza. And this is the math of Israeli work there. So I think even if Israel right, and the Hamas use all the hospitals, all the schools, all the buildings, so what's the meaning of that? So when the war ends, there will not be any one building standing in Gaza. There will not be any school, any hospital standing. So where is the limit? I think the US and other countries are not putting this question straightforward. And I think this is why we see the civilian damage in Gaza getting higher and higher. I have to say that I also don't trust the ICC. I think we will see first an American soldier being charged about Afghanistan before we will see an Israel. And I think I could say I don't agree with all of the campaigns that have been going on, but I think they already succeeded in putting pressure on the Biden administration to put pressure on Israel to change its policy regarding the humanitarian aid entrance to Gaza. So of course it's not perfect, but I think it's only because of the protests in the US of the activists and organizations and politicians that demanded that. So I think there's no process. There's total immunity to Israel, and it's not good. Even if the US think that Israel is right, we all have a responsibility to lower the human suffering, to lower the number of civilian casualties, And I think there is almost zero effort to do that nowadays.
Thank you very much, Eitay. And I just want to, I talked about, taking into account a country's past record and how it behaves during conflicts. And you're a source of information that is available to everybody, and that exporting officers should certainly be aware of are the different reports produced under the Human Rights Council. And here I have the report of the Independent International Commission of Inquiry on the Occupied Palestinian Territory. And this is a report that was released on 5 September of this year. And that report specifically addresses the targeting policies of the Israeli military forces and the attacks that are considered to be disproportionate. So that's one source of information. Now, just a reminder, I've seen attendees trying to raise their hands, and please post your questions in the question and answer function. And now we'll, to follow up on what Eitay's outlined, we will return to Josh. Josh, as has already been said, the US is a signatory, but is not a state party to the ATT. However, the reality is that as the state with the largest arms industry and as the leading exporter of conventional weapons, the United States is a significant actor, especially in this conflict. Josh, why would you argue that in this case, other states should not follow the example of the United States? And also just something else that I would ask for you to consider, Josh, and that is a question that we've had posted by Kelsey Gallagher, and that is, does the US new policy on conventional arms transfers, does this provide any better grounds for actually challenging US arms exports at this time? Over to you, Josh.
Yeah, thank you. And thank you for that additional question as well. It's a good place to start. So I think most of the audience here will be aware, but just to review, for those who aren't, that in February, the Biden administration issued a new conventional arms transfer policy, or CAT policy. And this is the guiding policy that every administration since Reagan actually has issued to sort of provide a framework through which the provision of arms to partners and allies around the world should be considered. What makes the Biden administration CAT policy stronger than any of its predecessors, frankly, in regards to human rights, is that it contains directive language for the first time. And that language says that the provision or the transfer of arms shall not be authorized when it is more likely than not that they will be used to commit human rights violations or to aggravate the risk of human rights violations. And I think, as we've heard in this discussion, there can be no doubt that US arms transfers are certainly aggravating the risk, and indeed, I think, leading to or causing human rights violations. The problem with actually holding the administration to account when it comes to the CAT policy is that it is just a policy. It is a national security memorandum. It is not a law. It is not even an executive order. And therefore, it is not binding upon the administration. So I think it is not the tool that you're looking for. It is an important, I think, in terms of the public debate and discourse, very important to point out the hypocrisy and the complete disregard for its own policy and its own commitments to human rights that the Biden administration is setting aside. But it is not binding upon the administration. In terms of other ways that the international community should not follow the US lead, I would note, of course, first of all, what the US is currently doing, and Doaa has referenced this, Eitay has referenced this, that the US is by far the leading provider of arms to Israel. And particularly since October 7th, it has been working to expedite the flow of arms through what I would call an all spigots approach, both through the standard foreign military sales and direct commercial sales processes, as well, of course, through the war reserve stockpile ammunition in Israel, Warsaw, Israel, the doors of which it has opened, and through other mechanisms, for example, through acquisition cross-servicing agreements, AXAs, which allow for the provision of things like fuel and unguided bombs. So the first thing is that America has been doing is really just opening the barn doors. And I think on that, one of the most important points I'd make in terms of what other countries should not do is, I think part of the reason America is doing this is that, the American people, the American government, I think all felt, as I did too, a sense of horror at the events of October 7th. But I think it is the responsibility of a government to act with reason, not with passion, to think through its decisions, to think through the consequences. And so I think one of the most important things I would advise all is to look at the example that we have set here of reacting, from the heart rather than from the head, and the damage that that can do. There are a couple of other quick things I'd like to touch on as well. First of all, there is really little that binds the US to follow international law, and I think that is not directly a consideration for many other, particularly Western countries, who are both signatories and ratifiers, for example, of the Arms Trade Treaty or of the UN Convention on the Rights of the Child, or various other relevant international law. You are not shielded from accountability like we, the US, are. And I always find it ironic when the Secretary of State, Secretary Blinken, talks about our commitment to the rules-based international order, because of course we pick and choose which rules we decide to sign up to. That is certainly within the parameters of how the system is designed to work. But I think, accountability is certainly something that other countries should be taking into account significantly. There have also been costs for the US of the current approach, and let's not forget those beyond the moral cost and the human cost in Gaza. There have been costs for American foreign policy in terms of relationships, particularly within the Middle East, and the damage that is being done to America as it binds itself to Israel's operations in Gaza, and as well in terms of how the global South perceives America and how much willingness there is to support other American initiatives, such as our long-standing support for Ukraine in its just war to defend itself against Russia. I think it makes it much harder for the US to accrue support for those critical votes in the UN General Assembly when we are standing behind one country facing occupation, but not behind the Palestinian people. So I think there are foreign policy consequences there as well that other countries would do well to note and to be aware of.
Thanks very much, Josh. It's a very sobering assessment that you make concerning the US and international law, but an assessment that we all do need to hear. We're now going to move on to our next round of questions, and this is on to the issue of exploring whether militarism is on the rise, and is this a trend that will prevail? It's worth reminding ourselves, and I think we do indeed have to be reminded of this, that in its preamble, the UN Charter sets as its overarching goal of saving succeeding generations from the scourge of war. Instead, today, we are witnessing increasing investments in weapons, a trend that was well underway in some regions even prior to the current conflict in Ukraine. To open this part of the discussion, and a person who's been waiting patiently, I'm delighted to hand over to Hebatalla Taha, who is an associate lecturer at London University. Heba, welcome, and over to you.
Thank you. Thank you for having me, and thank you everyone for joining us today. So we've seen an increase in militarism in the Middle East and beyond. And let me just briefly define what I mean by militarism. So the term can be defined as an extension of military influence to civilian spheres, including the economy and socio-political life. So let's just take a quick look at the situation in the Middle East. 2022 marked a peak in Israeli defense exports, although the country has already established itself as a hub for a global military industry since the late 1980s and has consistently expanded since then. The industry has still reached new heights. So in 2022, the industry's value was around $12.5 billion US dollars, having doubled in less than a decade and having increased 50% in 3 years. And one of the things that I would like to note about this trend is the new regional order within the Middle East, where there has been new levels of engagement with an acceptance of Israel following the 2020 Abraham Accords, which normalized Israel's relations with the United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, and Morocco. So in 2022, almost a quarter of Israeli arms exports, $3 billion, was with Arab states. In the previous year, the UAE and Bahrain alone accounted for $853 million of Israel's $11.4 million military export industry. So these figures signal an enthusiasm by Arab states who recently normalized relations with Israel to purchase weapons and other military technology. And in addition to representing new diplomatic alliances, these developments indicate an intensification of militarism in the Middle East. These securitized relations seem to now form the basis of a new regional order. So militarism includes both internal and external processes. It shapes domestic nation building as well as foreign policy. So it's linked to both domestic and foreign policies, and it's become a key tool for projecting power internally and also externally. In that context, we should understand Israeli-Arab relations as part of an attempt to develop militarized foreign policies, but also militarized national subjects across the region. States in the Middle East have increasingly sought to project power through militaries, both at home and abroad, which has driven this embrace of militarized relations. And so in that sense, resources that are invested into the arms trade are not only a diversion in terms of social and public welfare, but they also represent a crafting of a particular political future that centers and elevates the role of the military in everyday life. So in the 1990s, there was a lot of talk about the new Middle East as a way to invest in economic peace and as a way to move away from investment in militaries. And this premise of a new Middle East that was dominant throughout the 90s was that through economic integration, states in the Middle East can reduce investment in armament and militarization and in infrastructures of war making. It was also described as a way to allow states to invest that money back into the publics. But this hasn't happened. And paradoxically, the warmer relations that we've seen emerge in the Middle East and the decreased tensions between Israel and Arab states have emerged alongside increased militarization. States in the Middle East have continued to expand their militaries and to procure new weapons, even as these new diplomatic arrangements have emerged. And again, this suggests that the ideas of defense and security in the arms trade itself have become part of these national identities and internal politics as well. The millions that are spent in militaries, in investment in militaries, are central for foreign policy projections, which is something that has been noted, but there hasn't been so much attention focusing on how they articulate national identities through militarism. So I'm just going to give a few examples from across the region. So Morocco's recent military conscription bill is a case in point. It's been described as a way to address youth dissatisfaction, using the military as a vehicle to strengthen national identity and to socialize youth into military spaces. Egypt's military, as is well known, has its hands in nearly every aspect of everyday life, ranging from the economy to the media, and militarism is publicized in public spaces. The United Arab Emirates has invested extensively in defense and has plans to further expand military funding, while also emphasizing military-adjacent projects like space exploration, and militarization has generally been noted as a way for Gulf monarchies to strengthen their rule and develop a kind of post-rentier state identity. So this includes not only conscription, but also displays around national identity, whether public exhibitions, educational curricula, or other kind of big top-down projects. And again, these dynamics may not be necessarily new, but there has been an amplification and a spread. And this is something that seems to have been overlooked from political analysis when it comes to the arms trade. And it's in this kind of broader regional context that we need to understand what's happening in Israel-Palestine. Palestinians are living in this context of increased militarization in the region, but also increased indifference towards the Palestinian struggle, alongside, of course, an acceleration of settler colonialism. But they are unable to invest in a military, right? So there is this almost sacred belief in militarism, and I do think that examples like the Iron Dome may be relevant for us to consider because it aims to insulate the Israeli state from any potential violence by Palestinians. And in doing so, it enables Israel to continue the same policies regarding Palestine, not having to offer political concessions and instead using military technology to escape the harmful consequences of occupation, blockade, etc. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Heba. That was excellent, and it really set out for us the much broader context within the region, and provided a comprehensive picture about what has been happening. Now, I'm now going to return to Doaa. Doaa, on this, tell us your views on whether there is the rise of militarism, and will this prevail?
Yeah. Actually, Heba, the thing that I thought about, the aspect I thought about within that context of militarism in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict, and also in the context of the arms transfers, I mean, the first thing that came to my mind is settler violence in the West Bank. Once, of course, this is I'm gonna talk more about this later. But after October 7th happened, we read a lot of news items about the rising number of settler attacks. Around the same time, we also read in the news that the Israeli government decided to distribute different sorts of light weapons amongst the settlers. Maybe a week or two later, we also read in the news that some U.S. officials were concerned about private companies providing assault rifles to Israel, and at least specifically being concerned that some of those rifles at least will end up in the hands of Jewish settlers in the West Bank. Now, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm sorry, I keep on sharing data with you. I had a look at OCHA again, because it keeps track of settler violence and the outcomes of those outcomes of those attacks on the number of Palestinian casualties. Let me share those two slides with you. So this information, this data is from OCHA. Okay, so this slide is about the number of fatalities, which is deaths caused by settler violence in the West Bank, mostly in the West Bank, between 2008 and 2023. So as you could see, we can notice again a rise in the number of fatalities caused by this sort of violence. If we look at injuries, again, there is a rise between 2008 and 2023 from 195 injuries to 350 something. I can't read the whole slide because of the people's, yeah, I cannot see it fully, sorry. But it's more than 350. So, and we know that 2023 is not over yet, and more people might be attacked in the West Bank by settlers. And I would safely say by the end of if the trend keeps going on in the same manner, same way, the same rate, I would expect that number would double by the end of the year. Is this now a new problem? I don't think so. It's not a new problem. In fact, in 2012, I worked at the European Parliament, and at that time there was a spike in the number of settler attacks. Did this problem start then? Of course not. This problem was there in the West Bank, happening even in the 90s, because when I lived in the West Bank at the time, we were scared sometimes to travel between two Palestinian cities, any two Palestinian cities in the West Bank, because of settler attacks. So this is not a new problem. It is an old one, and this is depicted by the data provided by OCHA. It actually goes beyond the data of OCHA. It's just a problem that hasn't been catching much attention. Now, with the rifles, more rifles and personal weapons that could be used for personal purposes in the West Bank by settlers, I would expect more attacks to happen by settlers.
Yeah, thanks very much, Doaa. And you're absolutely right that this is not a new problem that has arisen since the start of this current conflict. It is an old problem, and it is a problem that different reports of the Human Rights Council have raised. For example, the report of the Special Rapporteur on Human Rights in the Palestinian territories, a report that was submitted this year on the 20th of October, raises exactly this issue and acknowledges that this has been a long-standing problem. So next to Eitay. Eitay, I understand that you might also wish to comment on this issue of settler violence, but what else would you also like to say about the rise of militarism in this context?
Oh, I think the rise of militarization, both societies, the Palestinian and the Israeli, were very militarized from different reasons, but in the recent years, we saw a huge increase in both sides. Both sides become more extreme, and also we saw a huge amount of weapon deliveries inside of Israel, in the West Bank to Israelis, but also by Iran to militant inside of the West Bank, and with that also the increase of the phenomenon of child soldiers. I think since, like it was said, since 7th of October, we see an increase in the fastening of the ethnic cleansing in the West Bank that's been going on for decades. There are community after community of shepherds and farmers that my friend Israeli activists go with them every day to their fields, to the grazing land, that are got threatening visits from the settlers armed with long rifles that come to their house and tell them, if you don't leave, we will use force to evacuate you tomorrow. And there were many incidents of violence. Just yesterday, I sent a letter to Canada and the US about a community that while the family was out of their encampment, a settler came and burned it in the Jordan Valley. So we see that the settlers are using the situation in Gaza and the atmosphere in Israel for the legitimacy for revenge to increase their attack on the Palestinians. And I have to say that through the years, I and the Israeli organization, we sent many letters to the international community to add violent settlers to the Magnitsky list, but we still haven't got a comment. Today I read that the US is considering it, maybe France, but I think we should wait with the champagne bottles. Inside of Israel, there is also a militarization. Part of it is from a human response to the 7th of October attack. I think because I don't know how many people read Hebrew, but the information what happened barely reach outside of Israel. But inside of Israel, people are asking, okay, what I will do if I have Hamas people in my house? I'm going to call the police and wait for them, like while they are killing me and my wife or torturing them. So there's a huge increase, like 250,000 of people ask for a rifle license and a gun license. But then we have the right wing in Israel that are using it to increase the military, to build like private militias, to create a pool of voters to the far wing, like the Minister of National Security, Itamar Ben-Gvir, was convicted in terror. So we see like there's a natural response to the 7th of October that I don't agree with it. I think it's very dangerous that everybody in Israel will be with a gun. I also have to say that we see the same demand for rifles in Druze and Bedouin communities because they are also considered as a collaborator and target for killing by Hamas. I don't think it's a solution, but people feel insecure. And then the far right is using it to increase the violence. And we already saw that there were in the events of May 2021, there were incidents where the far right went into mixed Jewish Arab cities and neighborhood inside of Israel. There were huge damage to Arab Palestinian property. There were lynch against Palestinians, and probably it will also increase inside of Israel. also the violence. I together with organization Forum Tag Mir, we represent dozens of Palestinian victims of Jewish terror through the years. Palestinians that their car were burned, that their houses were burned, that stones were thrown by Israelis on their vehicle while they were driving. Sometimes they were just injured, sometimes they got killed. So I think we are seeing increase in that. And we in the last year, but it will probably grow. So it's a huge problem. And as it was said, Doaa, the international media cannot have many subjects on the table. And this is really bad, because I think what the settlers are doing, they are attacking the most vulnerable communities. Many of them, that they left their house, they will not be able to return. They just live in encampments. They are so poor and weak. They will move and they will not return. And this is a huge success, not only for the settlers, because the settlers are the ends of the Israeli government. They work together. And I think you cannot, the Biden administration saying, okay, we wait for the two-state solution. But where are you now? Where the settlers in Israel, they are together hand in hand, are committing a very fast ethnic cleansing in the West Bank.
Thanks very much, Eitay, and thanks very much for really, setting out what are, describing what are the dynamics within Israel, and also, different groups that are taking advantage of this situation for their own ends. I want to come back to Josh and to ask a different question, and that is about the US and its arms sales. Does this really buy influence for the US?
So I think the question of how much leverage the US or any exporter of arms actually gets out of those transfers is a really complicated one. I think, first of all, there are several sort of pressure points or points in time where theoretically that leverage can be applied, right? So there is, before an arms sale is actually approved, before it actually happens, it can be dangled as an incentive for behavioral change. If you want, X fighter jet, then you need to take Y step or Y reform. I think it's probably most effective in that sense in a pretty narrow band where it comes to military operations, military behavior, rather than broad foreign policy areas. And so the two examples I'd give of that, for example, are, the US has had a defense relationship over the years with Nigeria, where the provision of A-29 Super Tucano jets has been used to push for enhanced training for better protection of civilians in air operations. And I think in that narrow space, it actually has had, I would argue, a net positive effect. On the other hand, when the US tries to use arms transfers for more geostrategic purposes and leverage, and here the example I would give would be the US relationship with Turkey, where sales of fighter jets and air defense systems have all become highly politicized, it's less clear that you get much more leverage, before a sale happens. Then, of course, the second pressure point is after the sale happens. And here, again, in theory, you can threaten to cut off spare parts, which are critical, as has been mentioned, for the operation of fighter jets, for example, cut off maintenance and sustainment. But that's very rare and very rarely used, so it's hard to say to what extent it works. And then, of course, there's the other side to it, in which weapons sales also give leverage to the partner over the exporter. The partner can come along and say, well, look, do you want us to buy from you or from China? And that's something that the US, in the context of strategic competition, has to take into account. And of course, then, once the sale happens, the US is implicated in the behavior of the partner and of the use of US origin material. And so there are sort of sunk costs in the outcome of a conflict, precisely because the US military technology and expertise has contributed to that conflict. I think there's a useful framework for thinking about this that was offered by Melissa Dalton, who used to work at the Center for Strategic and International Studies, CSIS, who provides a framework for leverage and security assistance, which is measuring essentially or weighing donor vulnerability against recipient vulnerability. Donor vulnerability being what are sort of the countervailing strategic interests in the partner country, and how much do we want it, and recipient vulnerability being the degree to which the recipient country is dependent on the donor for that assistance. How much do they want it? And I think when it comes to Israel and the US, there is a significant amount of recipient vulnerability. Israel really does need military assistance from America and military equipment. And there is theoretically a very low level of donor vulnerability. There is not much that we need from Israel, from the United States, except when it comes to politics and domestic politics in the US. And so this becomes, I think, less a question of what are the available tools than are you willing to use them? And as they say, it's not a lot of work if you don't do it. And I think in this instance there are tools available. The problem is not that leverage is not available to the US; it is that it's not willing to use it in any significant and meaningful way in the current conflict. There are signs, including today. I see there was a leaked cabinet memo that has come out from the Israeli government detailing Secretary Blinken sort of beginning to introduce a bit more pressure, beginning to talk about visa bans for those engaged in settler violence. But for as long as the weapons keep flowing, for as long as the leverage in the military assistance field is not being used, I think it's an open question as to what effect it could ever have, again, if we're not willing to use it.
Thanks very much, Josh. And, that's it's interesting how you break that down. And I'd never thought about that issue about, cutting off spare parts. Eitay, you want to come in here?
Yeah, I think things are more cynical, maybe, from what Josh is saying. I think probably the leak was organized, coordinated with the US because they wanted to show that they are making pressure on Israel. And I also think that Biden is, on one hand, is very attached to Israel. He's afraid that Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran will destroy Israel. And even if you think the Israeli government is crazy, he care about that there are half of the Jewish people in the world in Israel. But on the other hand, he also think, okay, I need to counter the leftist protest in Washington, D.C., or that if I delay the plane with the ammunition to Gaza in 5 minutes, Netanyahu is going to leak it to the media, and then I have a scandal in the Congress and the Senate. So I think things are very cynical the way they go behind it.
Thanks very much.
I think that's fair.
Yeah. Josh?
No, I was just going to say, I think that's fair. Maybe I give too much credit to the folks I used to work with, but I do think there are a lot of good people trying to make a difference here. But I think Eitay's cynicism is absolutely warranted until we see actual acts rather than words.
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, so we're now into the final round, and we are now in a very bleak moment. The fighting has resumed in Gaza today. We always knew that the truce was going to, the pause in the fighting was going to struggle to hold on. In this moment, and here this is really speaking to civil society and especially control arms members, what is it that you would recommend civil society to focus on? And I'll take you first, Josh, in 2 minutes.
Yeah, I'll go very quickly. I think the two big things for me that I would point to are, first of all, and I know this is already a focus for civil society, but transparency. If you don't know what's being transferred and when, then you have no ability to operate and to act. In the US system, there are differences in transparency between the foreign military sales system, the government-to-government system, which is significantly more transparent, although certainly below the congressional threshold, not very much. But compared to the export licensing system, the direct commercial sales, of course, the big problem we have right now in the Israel context is that the volume of material is going through the War Reserve Stockpile, WARSA, for which there is reporting to Congress, but very, very little transparency. So I'd say focus on transparency. A good example here that you might want to push for is the recently defunct US-Russia MANPADS arrangement, man-portable air defense system, in which whenever one country or the other was transferring man-portable air defense systems to another partner, it had to notify the other country. I think pushing for more transparency is number one. And number two, of course, is simply adherence to domestic law, pushing to ensure that there is adherence to domestic law, and strengthening domestic frameworks. taking, for example, the conventional arms transfer policy and writing it into law, defining some of those gaps that are in US law about what constitutes legitimate self-defense. What are the purposes for which US arms are provided? Do they include human rights abuses? One would think not. So I think those are the two biggest things: is closing the gaps in existing law and then enforcing those laws, and pushing for transparency. I think those are my top two.
Thanks very much, Josh. And that's an important message on transparency, especially considering what the challenges that Sam outlined earlier in taking litigation. There also transparency is a challenge, and this is an issue that simply must continue to be pushed on. Eitay, I realize that I've always had you as the number 2 speaker, and this continues in the last round as well. So over to you.
Yeah, I think from my experience as a human rights lawyer, the process and the procedures are really important because we are so weak to control the result. But sometimes the demand of doing a process, that there will be a hearing in the Congress, that there will be a procedure, rules of transparency, like Josh said. I think none of this exists when you talk about Israel. Israel is totally exceptional from all the rules. So I think demanding the process sometimes could be a way to slow it, and also to make the people in power think about what they are doing, to slow a bit the speed. Because as we see, like things are going very fast. Like from day one, like the US is delivering. The UK didn't want to be left over because they have the politics with the US. Germany had to jump, and then other countries that are also irrelevant also jump, and we see all the visits. So I think this is a great tool for us. And I think that already, as I said, the activist community already succeeded in pushing some changes that are not enough, but I think it will be much worse without them. So I think that when the war is finished, and it will be done sometime, there must be a campaign for accountability on both sides, because this is the cause of why we are today. The lack of accountability, like we've been through so many rounds of war in Gaza, so many deaths. There's no accountability, not on Israel and not on the Palestinian side, and this will only lead us to the next round. So I think this should be a huge demand, and not just to say, okay, the war is over, let's move to the next war.
Yeah, absolutely. And, whether we like it or not, I entirely agree with you that process is everything. Now, Heba, what are your thoughts on this matter?
Okay, I will also be very quick. I echo what was said already about transparency and accountability, but I also think that we need to show that militarism is not capable of producing the desired outcome strategically, right? Immediately after October 7th, there was a discussion about how Israel has to retaliate, but there was and still is no articulation of why, what that means. What does Israel gain through the military violence? What message is it trying to send by killing tens of thousands of Palestinians? Because if that message is about deterrence, about trying to prevent other attacks against Israel, it's going to have the opposite effect. So we need to show that violence will not bring about the desired results. And here I should emphasize that I'm not calling for a return to a slower pace of the violence either, or the idea that the conflict can just be managed, or that we overlook the everyday violence of the occupation and the blockade, which is often not visible to both outsiders and to Israelis, but rather that we need to emphasize political solutions rather than military solutions for the way forward.
Yeah, Heba, you're absolutely right that in the long term, this has to get onto a very different track. And, that really now is very much in the long term. And the final word is with Doaa. Doaa, what should civil society focus on? And if you can say a few words about what you think the research agenda from here on in needs to look at.
First, I would like to say I agree with all the proposed topics, but I would like to add at least one in addition to that list. To me, the media and the social media has been playing a very impactful role in particularly in the recent escalation in the Gaza Strip. So I would suggest that some work needs to be done on how the media, and including the social media, and the competing narratives, because it seems to me that we're not listening to each other. Like people are talking in each camp like with deaf ears. We just listen to what we want to listen. So I would appreciate a study or some work to be done on the impact of that on arms transfers. Would that encourage arms transfers? How would the media play a role in augmenting or decreasing arms transfers from country A to country B? Also, the impact of the media and the narratives being used on militancy. This is another aspect that I think would be relevant to examine closely and deeply in the Palestinian-Israeli conflict.
Thanks very much, Doaa, and that's a really, a really interesting aspect to it. Sam, very briefly.
Yeah, I would just say, add to all of those, which are excellent points. Stay out on the streets. Yeah. Governments, politicians need to see that there is not only disagreement but anger, that they will lose votes, that they will lose respect of the population if they continue their policies. There's been also a call from trade unions in Palestine, which has been followed by a lot of groups around the world, in the US and elsewhere, to actually block arms factories and arms carrying ships that are supplying arms to Israel. And there's been dozens of these protests which have actually blockaded ships or factories for at least a short amount of time. It won't actually stop the arms eventually getting there, but it does again show to governments, show to the companies that the consequences are not just political, that there are actual disruption happening if they continue these policies, and that the longer the war continues, the clearer these consequences will be.
Thanks very much, Sam, and that rounds it out very nicely. I just, really want to return to the ATT and next year. In 2024, the 10-year anniversary of the entry into force of the ATT will take place. The rules set out in the treaty are not some abstract or academic notions, but rather practical and obligatory measures to protect lives and ultimately to contribute to peace and security. These rules certainly have challenges, but they require the states parties to prioritise respect for international humanitarian law and human rights, and not to be driven by their economic, political and diplomatic interests. Clearly, there is much work to be done in addressing violations of the treaty. However, if the ATT is to be a credible forum, then we need to have these difficult conversations. Silence in the face of the suffering being witnessed in contexts such as Palestine is not an option. Now, I want to end now by really expressing my very deep appreciation to Doaa, Eitay, Josh, Heba and Sam for joining us today and sharing their expertise and experience with us. And I wish you all the very best in your future work and endeavours. Finally, I wish to thank you, the audience, for tuning in to what I hope has been an informative and useful discussion. So thanks very much, everybody, and good luck with the rest of your day. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.